Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the discussion and talk today about rib flare and rib expansion. What's the difference? I'm not going to just talk about the two, though. I'm going to go down the spectrum of movement when it comes to kind of the torso as one. So I'm going to talk about the concepts of rib flare, what that means, what ribs down means on the other side of the spectrum, and then where we usually need to meet, which is right in the middle in terms of movement quality. So before I talk about and break those smaller things down, I'm going to talk about why this subject and this topic is important for anybody who exercises, or if you're a coach trying to teach your clients, your athletes. And it doesn't matter if they're general population or they're athletes, because they're both the same. They're humans that need to possess these different movement qualities. Okay, so when I analyze movement and look at movement, it's not just what does the squat look like? What does your deadlift look like? What does your overhead press look like? I'm looking at people like Michael Jordan, Barry Sanders, Roger Federer, Bo Jackson, these guys that were absolute studs. Yes, they were genetic freaks, but they do possess certain movement qualities that make them great. And I think that's important to understand, because this is how your body functions. It doesn't just resist movement, or it's not just a rigid system. It's something that has the ability to express fantastic ranges of motion, and we can't forget about that. Mobility is your body's ability to express range of motion, whatever that may mean, through your hips, your shoulders, through your upper back. Now, stability is your ability to control that range of motion. Okay, and I think it's important that we integrate movement as a whole and not just focus on one side of things or one side of the spectrum. It should meet right in the middle. Okay, so where am I basing my information off of? So this is just basic functional anatomy, kinesiology, muscle function and actions, different fascial anatomy books that I've read over time, and then some concepts by Paul Chek that I really enjoy, because he's a fantastic teacher and he's a very smart guy when it comes to movement, and the human body is one. So first thing, what is rib flare? Rib flare is this concept of your pelvis, this structure, is tipped forward. So you have an arch in your back, and then what happens is your rib cage, this big structure, is up. So we have this scissor posture. This is referred to as a rib flare. Now, people have come up with the idea that the pelvis, right, and the thorax, the thoracic diaphragm and the pelvic diaphragm, need to sit on top of each other and stay there. I don't think that's how movement occurs. I think it's important to set the pelvis to neutral and then find good extension, and that is your base point. If we're telling people to pull the pelvis up and the rib cage down, we know that the rectus abdominis, the first muscle function and action of the rectus abdominis, is to flex the vertebral column. The second action is to compress the abdominal contents. So if we create a pattern that's rigid, and a pattern where we're pulling the vertebral column into flexion and systemic internal rotation as well, we now can, if you tell someone to brace their abs and pull their ribs down, you can't move your upper back. And since the abs flex the vertebral column, everything above the abs are pulled down and forward. That's just how the body works from a very basic biomechanical perspective. So that's what I'm looking at. So what is your base point? What is your base point? Before we actually go to the base point, do I think the ribs down cue has been used too frequently? Absolutely. If you're doing something like a row variation, I think it's important to always set the pelvis to neutral and then allow your upper body, the ribs to expand and then the ribs to compress, which is ribs down. We need both for good movement. Because if you have your ribs pulled down, you now can't do things like rotate, you can't overhead press well. If you try to take someone and overhead press them with their ribs down, look what that does not look good. Now you need extension in your upper back to allow your shoulder, your glenohumeral joint, to function well with your rib cage, because we know that the rib cage sets the tone for what this does and the position of this. If we're flexing the vertebral column, we can't allow these things to function like we want to. Okay, so certain exercises like overhead presses, if you're doing a chop, right, you're pulling down, ribs come down with the exhale. Inhale, ribs expand under a neutral pelvis. And we have to make sure that there's not compensations happening in the spine. Okay, so what is base point in my mind? So the base point is always set the pelvis to neutral, and it's going to be very hard for someone with thoracic flexion, which we see a lot, to do this. And this is a good thing. We want to create new neuromuscular associations so they can move better. If we tell someone who's in thoracic flexion in a state of exhalation all day to pull their ribs down, it doesn't work. We're feeding into that dysfunction. Again, just back to basic kinesiology. So what I think of base point is set the pelvis. I like doing a half kneeling variation because you can really focus on that hip, and then just get someone as upright as they can and drive their breastbone up. And what you'll see is a bunch of compensations happen. For a lot of people, they'll start to lean back or extend from their lumbar spine. If you tell someone who's in thoracic flexion to pull their rib cage up, the first thing they do is this. Because it's hard for them to fight for that position. Guess what? Hard is good. I think pulling the ribs down it's easy. It puts them in their lumbar spine's fine, but where is everything else? Look for a good neutral spine and work from there. Now, a lot of people will say, what if you have someone that has a flat thoracic spine or a heavy extension pattern? Again, set the pelvis, get as much extension as you can, and then from there, we know that someone with a flat T-spine or even adducted shoulders has an anterior ribcage shift. So they're heavy forward. What they need to do is fill their rib cage with air more in the back. So to do that, the first thing I like to do is put my hands on someone's shoulders and tell them to resist against me. I try to push in and I tell them to push out. And that expands their rib cage this way, which gives us more space to work front to back. Now you put a finger here, a hand on the back, and tell them to breathe there. Now we have a full expanded rib cage in someone who's in a heavy extension pattern and a good neutral pelvis. Now we have good alignment. This is our base point. This is where we need to work. Okay? When you do an overhead press, ribs expand, under a neutral pelvis. Ribs come down. Ribs come up because they need to, because the rib cage sets the tone for the shoulder and the neck. Exhale on the way down. Okay, so again, this will work for people who are in a flexion pattern. It's going to be super hard. You're going to see like 4 or 5 different compensations pop up, but this is important, guys. It's important for someone who's in a heavy extension pattern to get full expansion in the rib cage because they lack it in the back and the sides. And that's about it. So again, it's not about rib flare. Rib flare is a concept, and we might need that in certain types of movement. The ribs down, we need in certain types of movement, but we need to find this base point where both can work. We need the ribs to expand. We need them to come down on forced expiration. Inhale, expansion. Inhale, expansion. Exhale, ribs down. Always under a neutral pelvis. And then once people understand those basic base points of finding neutral spine, that's where we can start to take like a medicine ball overhead toss, and we can start implementing a little bit more multi-segmental movement, right? If you're someone who understands SFMA, you know that you test like multi-segmental flexion, which we are training more now, and then you also test extension and rotation, but everybody stays away from the extension. Your abs also have the ability to lengthen. If your hips come forward, if your hands go back, and you get good multi-segmental extension through your spine during a medicine ball slam, that's good. You need a stretch. That'll create a reflexive, boom, elastic movement. If you look at like a basketball player, Michael Jordan, who slam dunks a ball, he's getting separation, expansion, boom, and then you get that elastic whip action, bang, and then everything comes down and forward. Again, this is how the body works. Express your ranges of motion that you have in a controlled fashion. It's not about being rigid. If we tell people this is how you move, we create associations outside of the gym where they use this pattern, and that's just not how the body functions. So again, it's not just about rib flare. It's not just about ribs down. It's right in the middle. We need everything. But understand that, set the pelvis, look at where the thorax is and where you find a neutral spine. And what you'll see, if you go into a mirror and check this out, you'll see that you actually do have rib expansion. And that's fine. That's how your body works. From there, when you overhead press, your ribs will come down when they need to. They'll go up when they need to. Focus on that. All right, guys, keep that in mind. Thanks for listening. Peace.